April 29, 1945. Bavaria, Germany. 3:47 a.m. A man is burning the evidence. Carl Drestle, SS-Sturmbannführer, stands in the courtyard of a facility 40 miles east of the advancing American front line, watching his own paperwork catch fire. Prisoner manifests. Transport records. Administrative logs documenting 2 years of systematic, methodical, industrial-scale human suffering. He feeds them into the barrel one by one methodically, the way he has done everything in his career, without hesitation, without visible emotion, with the precise efficiency that had earned him his rank and his posting and his command. Around him 2,000 people are still alive. For now. He has orders in his pocket that say they should not be alive by morning. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of our community. Every subscriber makes this journey possible. What you are about to hear is not the story of a famous general's famous battle. It is not the story of a tank charge or an air raid or a strategic breakthrough that changed the maps in some headquarters somewhere. It is the story of a single message, 20 sentences, delivered to one man by one man in the last hours before a decision became irreversible. And it saved 2,000 lives in a single night. The man who wrote it was George S. Patton. The man who received it was a killer with orders and a deadline. And the only thing standing between 2,000 people and those orders was a piece of paper and the weight of a name. April 1945. The Third Army's advance through Bavaria. By the final weeks of the war in Europe, George Patton's Third Army had become something that even its own soldiers struggled to describe accurately. It was not simply a military force moving through territory. It was a relentless, grinding, accelerating machine that had covered more ground faster than almost any comparable force in the history of mechanized warfare. Since crossing the Rhine in late March, the Third Army had advanced hundreds of miles. It had shattered German defensive lines that other commanders had estimated would hold for weeks. It had outrun its own supply lines, improvised solutions, and kept moving. Patton had done this through a combination of calculated aggression and absolute refusal to allow the pace to slow. He understood something that many commanders did not, or understood intellectually, but could not execute emotionally, that in the final stages of a collapsing defense speed itself was a weapon. Every hour the advance continued was an hour the enemy could not reorganize, could not establish new lines, could not bring reserves forward. The Third Army moved because Patton understood that stopping even briefly gave the enemy something that momentum had already taken away. But Bavaria, in April 1945, was not only a military campaign. It was a revelation. As the Third Army swept through the Bavarian countryside, its units began encountering things that had no equivalent in any military training or any prior combat experience. The camps. Not all of them were the large industrial facilities that the world would later come to know through photographs and testimony and the Nuremberg proceedings. Many of them were smaller. Transit camps, labor facilities, places that had been built and administered for the specific purpose of extracting everything a human body could produce, and then discarding the remainder. The men and women inside these facilities came from every country German power had touched. French resistance fighters, Polish civilians, Soviet prisoners of war, Jewish families from Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, political prisoners from Germany itself, men who had said the wrong thing, believed the wrong thing, or simply been standing in the wrong place when the state decided they were inconvenient. Patton had spent a career building the psychological armor that senior commanders require to function. He had seen men die in every way that modern warfare could kill them. He had processed the aftermath of battles that left landscapes unrecognizable. He had developed over decades the capacity to absorb horror and convert it immediately into operational decision-making. The camps broke through that armor in a way nothing else had. His diary entries from this period are different from anything else he wrote during the war. The operational clarity is still there. The precise tactical thinking, the relentless focus on what needs to be done next. But underneath it, visible between every line, is something that the entries from Normandy and the Bulge and the Rhine crossing do not contain. A quality of rage that is not hot, but cold. Not explosive, but permanent. The kind that does not dissipate after the situation is resolved, but calcifies into something that shapes every subsequent decision. He had made a private commitment by the time his forces reached central Bavaria. The people responsible for what he was seeing were going to answer for it. Not in some abstract future justice. In the specific, documented, individually prosecuted accounting that he intended to spend whatever authority and energy he had left ensuring would happen. April 29, 1945. Intelligence Report. 0600 hours. The report arrived at Patton's headquarters in the early morning. It had been compiled from 3 independent sources, which was unusual, and which immediately elevated its credibility. A group of escaped prisoners had made contact with American forward units and provided a location and a description. A local German civilian, one of the many who claimed to have known nothing about what had been happening around them, had independently confirmed the location to an American intelligence officer. An aerial reconnaissance had photographed a facility matching both descriptions approximately 40 miles east of the current front line. The facility held approximately 2,000 prisoners. It was under the command of SS-Sturmbannführer Carl Drestle. Drestle was not a name in the major war crimes documentation that Allied intelligence had already been compiling for months. He was not one of the architects. He was not one of the men whose photographs appeared in the files that were being prepared for what would eventually become the Nuremberg trials. He was a mid-level SS officer who had been assigned to run a facility and had run it for 2 years with the documented efficiency that the SS system demanded and rewarded. He had administered it without recorded complaint. He had done his job, and then the intelligence report included the detail that changed everything. Drestle had received orders. The orders had come down through the SS command structure in the chaotic, disintegrating final days of the regime, passed through channels that were still functioning even as everything around them collapsed. The orders were the orders that Allied intelligence had been dreading since the advance into Germany began, the orders that said the facility was not to fall into American hands intact. The prisoners were not to be liberated. They were to be eliminated before the Americans arrived. The facility was to be destroyed. Drestle had not yet carried out these orders. The intelligence suggested he was waiting. For confirmation possibly. Or because even within the SS there were men who hesitated at the final step, or for reasons no one outside his command post could know with certainty. But he had not refused the orders either. He had 2,000 people and a deadline and an advancing army getting closer by the hour. Patton read the report once. Then he read it again. Then he called his operations officer and asked a single question: how fast could a relief column reach the facility? The answer was 6 hours under standard conditions. Patton said he did not want standard conditions. He wanted to know how fast if speed was the only variable. The answer was 4 hours. Possibly 3.5 if the column moved immediately and encountered nothing significant on the roads. Patton ordered the column to move. Then he did something no one on his staff anticipated. He dictated a message to Drestle. The message. It was transmitted on frequencies that German SS units were known to be monitoring. Simultaneously, it was carried by a captured German officer given safe passage to deliver it personally to Drestle's position. Patton wanted to eliminate every possible reason for the message to fail to arrive. He wanted Drestle to receive it, and he wanted Drestle to know exactly who had sent it, because the name meant something in the German military that Patton was not too proud to leverage when leverage was the correct tool. The message was the shortest formal communication Patton sent to any enemy commander during the entire war. It told Drestle that Patton knew about the facility, knew about the orders, knew they had not yet been carried out. It told him a relief column was already moving and would arrive within hours. It told him that every prisoner alive when that column arrived would be counted in his favor in the accounting that was coming, and that every prisoner who was not alive would be counted against him, and that the accounting was going to be thorough and complete, and nothing Drestle or anyone else could do would prevent it. And then it said something else. It said that Patton had spent weeks moving through Germany, that he had seen what the SS had built and what the SS had administered, that he was speaking with complete clarity when he said that the men responsible were going to answer for it personally, regardless of rank, regardless of claims about following orders. It said Drestle still had a choice that most of the men responsible no longer had, because most of them were dead or captured or running. The choice was simple: keep the prisoners alive, surrender the facility when the column arrived, or carry out the orders and face consequences that Patton described in language his staff later said was the most direct and unambiguous threat they had ever heard him produce. He said that if the prisoners were harmed, Drestle should not expect the protections of the Geneva Convention, because the Geneva Convention was an agreement between soldiers, and what Drestle had been administering was not soldiering. He said he would pursue the matter personally completely, and that no distance, no surrender, no legal process, and no claim of having followed orders would be sufficient to put it beyond his reach. The officer who watched Patton dictate this message said years later that it took 20 minutes. He said he had never seen Patton compose anything with that quality of focus. Not operational orders, not strategic communications, not the famous speeches. This was different. This was a man who had made a calculation that the combination of an approaching column and the absolute credibility of a threat was the best available instrument for keeping 2,000 people alive long enough for the gates to open. 4 hours later. The confirmation arrived at Patton's headquarters. The column had reached the facility. The guards had withdrawn. Drestle himself was not present. He had either fled or was in the process of surrendering himself to a different American unit, having made his own calculation about the wisdom of being in the immediate vicinity of 2,000 people he had administered when their liberators came through the gates. The prisoners were alive. All of them, or very nearly all, within the brutal margin of what the facility had already done to them before any orders arrived, before any message was sent, before any column moved. 2,000 people were alive who might not have been. When Patton received this news at his headquarters, his staff watched him go quiet for a moment. Then he asked about their condition. The answer was what the answer always was at these places: severe malnutrition, medical emergencies, people reduced by deliberate policy to states that would take months of care to begin to address. Alive. But with everything that word meant in that context, Patton ordered full medical resources diverted to the facility immediately. He redirected food supplies. He gave the orders with the same operational precision he brought to every military problem. Then that evening he wrote in his diary. He wrote that he did not know whether it was the message or the column or something inside Drestle himself that had produced the outcome. He wrote that he did not particularly care because the outcome was what mattered. He wrote that he had meant every word. He wrote that 2,000 people were alive tonight who might not have been, and that this was the thing he would remember about this day. Drestle was captured 3 days later by a different American unit. But the question of what happened next, what the accounting Patton promised actually looked like, whether any of it was enough, and what the testimony of the survivors revealed about those final hours inside the facility, that is a story that requires its own telling. Because what those 2,000 people experienced in the hours before the gates opened was something that no message and no column and no general's name could fully reach. And in part 2, you will hear it from the people who lived it. April 29th, 1945. 10:23 a.m. The gates opened. 2,000 people walked into sunlight they had not expected to see again. That is where part 1 ended. A message. A column. A choice made by one man under pressure that most human beings will never experience. Drestle stood down. The prisoners lived. Patton received the confirmation at his headquarters and wrote in his diary that 2,000 people were alive tonight who might not have been. But here is what the diary did not record. What happened inside those walls in the 7 hours between the moment Drestle received Patton's message and the moment the American column came through the gates, that story belongs to the people who lived it. And what they described in the years that followed changed the way historians understood not just this incident but the entire psychology of the final collapse of the SS system in Bavaria. Because Patton's message did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived in the middle of something. The facility had been in a state of controlled terror for 72 hours before the message reached Drestle's hands. The guards knew the Americans were coming. They could hear it not metaphorically, but literally. Artillery. Distant at first, then closer. The sound of a front line dissolving. Every man in SS uniform at that facility understood what the sound meant for them personally. Some had already made arrangements. 2 junior guards had slipped away in the night of April 27th, changing into civilian clothes taken from the prisoner storage and walking east toward Munich. Drestle knew this and had not reported it, which was itself a signal of how far the command structure had already fractured. The prisoners knew something had changed before anyone told them anything. This is documented in the testimony of a Hungarian woman named Marta Vasarhelyi, who had been in the facility for 11 months. She described it in an interview given to a journalist in 1948. She said the guards stopped making eye contact. Not with the prisoners, they had never made eye contact with the prisoners. They stopped making eye contact with each other. She said that in 11 months she had learned to read the atmosphere of the facility the way a sailor reads weather. And the atmosphere in those 72 hours felt like nothing she had experienced before. Not the controlled bureaucratic cruelty of an ordinary day. Something suspended. Something unresolved. She did not know about the orders Drestle had received. None of the prisoners knew. They knew only that the sound of artillery was getting closer, and that the guards were different, and that the difference could mean liberation, or it could mean something else entirely, and there was no way to determine which until it happened. Drestle received Patton's message at approximately 6:40 a.m. on April 29th. The captured German officer who carried it had been given safe passage and had walked the last mile to the facility's outer perimeter on foot, waving a white cloth. A guard brought him to Drestle's command post. Drestle read the message once, then he dismissed everyone in the room and read it again alone. What went through his mind during the next 2 hours is not documented. He left no diary. He gave no testimony that addressed this specific period directly. What is documented is what he did. He called his senior guards together. He told them the Americans were closer than the last intelligence had indicated. He told them their orders regarding the prisoners were being suspended pending clarification from higher command. A fiction since the command structure above him had effectively ceased to function days earlier. He told them to stand down from active duty posture and to remain at their posts, but to take no action regarding the prisoner population. Then he sent a messenger to find out exactly where the American column was. The messenger came back with a number. 31 miles. Moving fast. Estimated arrival 3 to 4 hours. Drestle looked at that number. He looked at the orders in his pocket. He looked at the message from Patton on the desk in front of him. And he made the only calculation that a man with his specific combination of cowardice and self-preservation instinct could make. He ordered his staff car. He was gone within 20 minutes. The guards he left behind received no further orders. Some stayed at their posts out of habit or confusion, or the absence of any alternative plan. Others began drifting toward the perimeter. By 9 a.m., the facility's guard complement had reduced from 41 men to somewhere between 12 and 15, depending on which account you consult. The ones who remained were not there out of loyalty to the regime. They were there because they had nowhere else to go, and no civilian clothes, and no plan, and no vehicle. And the sound of American engines was already audible on the Eastern Road. Inside the facility, the prisoners felt the change without understanding it. Marta Vasarhelyi described it as a silence that was different from other silences. The facility had its own rhythms, the sounds of guards changing shifts of the morning roll call of the administrative machinery of captivity running its daily cycle. Those sounds stopped. Not gradually. All at once, the way a clock stops. She said that a man named Alexander, a Polish engineer who had been there longer than almost anyone, stood up in the middle of the barracks and said very quietly in Polish that something had happened. Nobody asked what. They all understood what he meant. Something had changed outside their walls. The question was whether the change was the thing they had been waiting for or the thing they had been afraid of. For 2 hours, they did not know. Then they heard engines, not German engines. The sound was different. American vehicles have a different mechanical signature, and there were prisoners in that facility who had heard American vehicles before on the outside before their arrests and who recognized the difference immediately. A man near the window of the main barracks began to laugh, not hysterically, quietly in a way that was somehow more affecting than any other reaction could have been. He laughed the way a person laughs when they realize that a thing they had stopped believing in has turned out to be real. The column came through the gates at 10:23 a.m. The soldiers who entered that facility were not unprepared for what they would find. By April 1945, Third Army units had liberated enough of these facilities that their commanders had developed procedures and briefings and protocols. They knew what severe malnutrition looked like. They knew to move slowly, to speak calmly, to avoid any gesture that could be misread as threat. They knew that the people they were about to encounter had been conditioned by months or years of captivity to flinch at sudden movement and loud sound and uniforms of any kind. What the briefings could not fully prepare them for was the specific quality of the moment. A sergeant named Douglas Whitfield from Dayton, Ohio, wrote a letter home that described it. He wrote that he had expected the prisoners to rush the gates. That is what he had imagined, a flood of people chaos noise. Instead, he wrote, they stood still. All of them, watching the column enter. Some of them were crying, some were not. Most of them, he wrote, just stood there and looked at the soldiers, the way you look at something you have been told exists but have never seen with your own eyes. He wrote that it was the quietest thing he had ever experienced in 11 months of combat. The medical teams that accompanied the column documented what they found with clinical precision. Of the 2,000 prisoners, 1,847 were ambulatory. The remainder required immediate medical intervention. Average body weight among adult male prisoners was documented at 41 kilograms, approximately 90 pounds. Documented cases of active tuberculosis, 23. Cases of severe edema from malnutrition, 67. The medical officer in charge requisitioned additional supplies within the first hour and sent an urgent request back to the Corps rear area for specific medications that the column had not carried in sufficient quantity. These numbers reached Patton's headquarters by early afternoon. He read them with the same cold focus he had brought to every intelligence report for the past 3 years. Then he ordered the full medical response he had already pre-authorized. He ordered his quartermaster to redirect food convoys. He signed the orders without discussion because there was nothing to discuss. This was the work. Drestle was captured 3 days later, 40 miles west of the facility, in a farmhouse outside Augsburg. He was dressed in civilian clothes. He had a forged identity document identifying him as a schoolteacher from Regensburg. The American soldiers who found him had no idea who he was until an intelligence officer ran his physical description against the list of known SS personnel who were being actively sought. The match took 4 hours. His case was referred to the war crimes investigators who were processing thousands of similar cases across the Allied occupation zones. The proceedings would take years. The documentation was voluminous and damning. Whether Patton's message was formally entered into the record, whether the fact that the prisoners were alive when the column arrived was weighed against the orders he had received, these details are not cleanly resolved in the available historical record. The proceedings produced outcomes that satisfied almost no one, which was the predictable result of applying legal architecture to acts that had been designed and executed outside any legal or moral framework that the architecture had been built to address. What is not ambiguous is the testimony of the survivors. In the interviews conducted by journalists and historians in the years after the war, the prisoners described those final hours with a consistency that crosses languages and decades. They described the silence when the guards stopped moving. They described Alexander standing up and saying something had happened. They described the sound of the engines. They described Whitfield's column coming through the gates. None of them knew about the message. None of them knew about Patton's name on a piece of paper, or the frequencies it had been broadcast on, or the captured German officer who had walked the last mile with a white cloth. They knew only that the gates had opened. But here is what the survivors also described, something the historians noted and then largely set aside because it did not fit cleanly into any analytical framework. Several of them described a period in the 2 hours between the guards standing down and the column arriving when they understood that something had changed, but did not yet know what. When they were suspended between two possible futures. When the question of which future they were moving toward was entirely outside their control and entirely dependent on decisions being made by people they had never met and would never meet. They described what they did during those 2 hours. Most of them said the same thing. They waited, and they talked to each other, and some of them prayed, and some of them, like the man near the window whose name none of the other survivors could remember, did something that nobody could fully explain. They refused in those 2 hours to stop believing that the engines they could hear in the distance were coming for them. In Part 3, we follow the men who drove those engines and uncover the order that Patton gave before any of this began. The order that his own superiors tried to countermand, the order that, if it had been stopped, would have meant those gates never opened at all. The gates opened. 2,000 people walked into sunlight. That is where Part 2 ended. Drestle fled. The column arrived. The prisoners lived. Patton read the medical reports that afternoon and ordered every resource he had toward that facility without discussion because there was nothing to discuss. The work was the work. But here is what nobody at Patton's headquarters knew on the afternoon of April 29, 1945. Drestle had not acted alone in receiving those orders. The directive to eliminate prisoner populations before Allied forces arrived had gone out to 17 separate SS facility commanders across Bavaria and Western Austria in the final week of April. 17 facilities, tens of thousands of people. And in most of those facilities, the commanders had already carried out their orders before any American column got close enough to matter. Patton's message reached one man, one facility, one set of gates. The other 16 were already done. And now, with the war in its final hours, the question was no longer whether the killing would stop. The question was whether anyone responsible for it would ever actually answer for what they had done. Because the SS commanders who had carried out their orders were already running, changing clothes, forging documents, disappearing into the rubble of a collapsing country where 10 million displaced people were moving in every direction at once. The accounting Patton had promised was about to face its hardest test. The intelligence picture that reached Third Army headquarters in the days following the liberation was deeply uneven. Some of it was methodical and documented the work of Allied intelligence teams, who had been moving with the advance specifically to secure records before they could be destroyed. Some of it was chaotic, fragmentary, built from survivor testimony, and the half-burned files that Drestle and men like him had not quite finished destroying before they ran. What emerged from that picture was a geography of decisions, a map of which commanders had waited, which had hesitated, which had acted immediately, and which, like Drestle, had made a calculation that self-preservation outweighed ideology at the final moment. The variation across those 17 facilities was significant. 3 commanders had refused the orders outright and were subsequently shot by their own deputies, who then carried out the orders anyway. 4 had carried out the orders within hours of receiving them with documented efficiency. The remaining 10 fell somewhere in a terrible middle ground, with outcomes that depended on factors as specific and contingent as the distance of an American column, the resolution of a single officer, or the accidental timing of a reconnaissance aircraft. Patton absorbed this intelligence with a quality of stillness that his staff recognized as more dangerous than his famous explosions of anger. He did not shout. He did not pace. He sat and read, and asked precise, focused questions, and made notes in the margins of documents. He had been a soldier for 35 years, and he understood intellectually that wars produced outcomes that were distributed across a spectrum of justice and injustice with no reliable correlation between what people deserved and what they received. He understood this. He had understood it since the First War. Understanding it did not make it acceptable. He sent 3 communications in the 48 hours following the liberation. The first was to his own corps commanders, ordering that war crimes documentation be treated as a primary mission objective equal to tactical advance, meaning that the team securing records and taking testimony were not to be pulled for other duties regardless of operational pressure. The second was to Allied Forces headquarters, requesting additional investigators and arguing in language that was unusually direct, even for Patton, that the documentation window was closing, and that every day of delay meant another destroyed file and another escaped perpetrator. The third was a private note to Eisenhower that his staff was not permitted to read before it was sealed. What that note said has never been fully established. Eisenhower's response 3 days later was a 1-paragraph acknowledgement that the matter was being addressed at the appropriate level. Patton wrote in his diary that night that he did not know what appropriate level meant in this context, but that he intended to find out. May 2, 1945. Augsburg. The capture. Drestle was found in a farmhouse on the eastern outskirts of Augsburg at 1417 on May 2nd. He had traveled approximately 40 miles from the facility in 3 days, moving at night, sheltering in agricultural buildings during daylight. He was wearing civilian clothes, dark wool trousers, a white shirt, a jacket that had belonged to the farmhouse owner's deceased husband. He had a forged identity document identifying him as Karl Brenner, a schoolteacher from Regensburg. The document was competently made. It would likely have passed casual inspection by a soldier who had no specific reason to look harder. The soldiers who found him were not looking for him specifically. They were conducting a routine sweep of the area as part of the standard advance protocol, checking outbuildings and farmhouses for concealed German military personnel. The corporal who opened the farmhouse door later said that Drestle had seemed calm. Not the aggressive calm of someone who had prepared a cover story and was confident in it. A different kind of calm. The calm of someone who had already made their calculation and was waiting to see how it resolved. The corporal asked for identification. Drestle produced the Karl Brenner document without hesitation. The corporal looked at it, looked at Drestle, and for a reason he said he could not entirely explain something about the hands, the posture, a quality of practiced stillness that didn't match the document's story. He called for his sergeant. The sergeant called for the unit's intelligence attachment. The intelligence officer ran Dressle's physical description against a list that had been circulating for 48 hours, SS personnel from facilities in the immediate area who were actively being sought. Age, height, build. Coloring, a specific scar on the left forearm documented in personnel records. The match confirmation took 4 hours because the radio communication was slow and the records were being cross-referenced from multiple locations. At 1840, the confirmation came back. The intelligence officer arrested Karl Brenner and told him his real name. Drestle said nothing. He sat in the farmhouse kitchen with his hands on the table and said nothing for 6 hours while the processing paperwork was completed and transport to a holding facility was arranged. The soldiers who were with him during those 6 hours said later that he ate the food they gave him. K rations. 2 crackers, a tin of pressed meat, and drank the coffee and sat quietly and did not speak and did not ask questions and gave no indication of what was happening inside whatever he was using in place of a conscience. He was transferred to the war crimes holding facility at Augsburg the following morning. His case file was already substantial. The documentation team that had gone through the facility after the liberation had worked for 72 hours straight, and what they had found was what was always found at these places: administrative records of a precision that was obscene in the context of what they documented. Transfer manifests, intake records, work assignment logs, mortality statistics compiled with the same clerical care one might apply to a factory's production output, all of it bearing Drestle's signature or his initials or his authorization stamp because he had run an efficient operation, and efficient operations generate paper trails. The prisoner's testimony began arriving at the War Crimes Office the same week. It took time. Most of the survivors needed medical stabilization before formal interviews were possible. Several were too ill to give testimony for weeks. But the investigators were patient because the documentation they had was strong enough to build a case with or without survivor testimony, and the survivor testimony, when it came, would make it stronger. Marta Wasserheli gave her testimony on May 19, 1945, from a hospital bed in Munich, where she had been transferred after her weight had stabilized sufficiently for transport. She spoke for 4 hours. The investigator who conducted the interview wrote in his notes that she was precise, composed, and detailed in a way that spoke to both her own intelligence and to the particular quality of attention that people who have survived extreme circumstances sometimes develop the ability to observe and retain when everything in the situation argues for not observing and not retaining, because observation and retention are forms of resistance, and resistance is the only thing that can be practiced in a situation where everything else has been taken away. She described 11 months. She described the administrative rhythms of the facility. She described the guards by their behaviors and their habits and their particular methods. She described Drestle as a presence that was felt more than seen. A man whose decisions shaped every day of her captivity, but who rarely appeared directly in the spaces where the prisoners lived, because the architecture of the system meant that the person responsible for everything that happened to you was also the person you were least likely to ever directly encounter. She described the final 72 hours. The change in the guards, Alexander standing up, the 2 hours of suspension, the sound of the engines. At the end of the interview, the investigator asked her if she had anything else she wanted to add. She said yes. She said she wanted the record to show that when the American soldiers came through the gates, the first one through the corporal at the front of the column stopped when he saw the prisoners standing there watching him. He stopped for a moment and looked at them, and then he took off his helmet. She said she did not know why he did that. She had thought about it many times since, and she still did not know whether it was a reflex or a gesture or something he had decided to do in that moment. But she said that when he did it, something happened in the crowd of prisoners that she did not have a word for in any language she spoke. She said it was the moment she knew, with the complete certainty, that her body understood before her mind could process it, that the thing they had been waiting for had actually happened. The war in Europe ended 6 days later, on May 8, 1945. Patton's Third Army had covered more ground in the final campaign than any comparable force in the theater. It had liberated hundreds of facilities, towns, and prisoner populations. It had processed thousands of prisoners of war and displaced persons and generated documentation that would feed the Nuremberg proceedings for years. Patton attended the German surrender ceremony and then went back to work. But what happened to the man who wrote the message? What happened after the cameras went away and the proceedings dragged on and the world moved toward Reconstruction and Cold War and the particular amnesia that follows catastrophe, that is a story with a chapter that almost nobody knows? And it begins not with a victory. It begins with a letter. In Part 4 we follow that letter, and we find out what Patton's promised accounting actually produced and what it cost him, and whether the 2,000 people who walked through those gates on April 29, 1945, ever learned the name of the man who made it possible. The letter arrived at Patton's headquarters on May 12, 1945, 4 days after Germany surrendered, 4 days after the guns went quiet across Europe and the administrative machinery of victory began grinding through the wreckage of a continent. Patton was already deep in the work of occupation, managing displaced persons, overseeing prisoner processing, attending the meetings that victorious generals must attend when the fighting stops and the politics begin. The letter was from a survivor of the facility. It had been written in Hungarian and translated by a Third Army interpreter. It was addressed simply to the American general who sent the message. Whoever handled the mail had known immediately who that meant. Patton read it. Then he folded it and put it in his uniform pocket where it stayed for the rest of the day. His aide said he never spoke about what was in it. What happened to George Patton after the war ended is not a story of triumph. He received command of the 15th Army, a largely administrative posting, responsible for compiling the official history of the European campaign. It was, by any honest assessment, a demotion dressed as an honor. The man who had driven the Third Army further and faster than any comparable force in the theater was now managing historians and archivists in a headquarters in Bad Nauheim. The reasons were political and documented. Patton had made statements about the former Nazi administrative apparatus that directly contradicted Allied denazification policy. He had been publicly provocative in ways that Eisenhower could not defend and could not ignore. He believed, or said he believed, that the machinery of German civil administration, including personnel who had served under the Nazi government, could be usefully employed in rebuilding the occupation zone, rather than systematically removed. His superiors disagreed. More precisely, they found his public expression of that disagreement intolerable. He was relieved of command of the Third Army on October 7, 1945. He never commanded troops again. On December 9, 1945, his staff car was involved in a low-speed collision on a road outside Mannheim. The other vehicles involved sustained minor damage. Patton's neck was broken. He was paralyzed from the shoulders down. He died 12 days later on December 21, 1945, in a military hospital in Heidelberg. He was 60 years old. He had survived 3 years of some of the most intense combat command of the 20th century, and died in peacetime in a car accident on a German secondary road. He was buried at his own request with the men of the Third Army who had fallen in Luxembourg, not in a general's grave set apart from the others. Among them, the officer who had watched him dictate the message to Drestle, the one who said years later that it was the most focused communication he had ever witnessed Patton produce, learned of Patton's death while stationed in Frankfurt. He wrote in his own diary that night, he meant every word of everything he ever said. That was the thing about him, that nobody who hadn't seen it up close could fully understand. He always meant every word. The accounting Patton had promised the survivors did happen. Imperfectly slowly, with the grinding inadequacy that characterizes all legal processes applied to crimes that exceed the frameworks built to address them. But it happened. The Dachau trials conducted by American military tribunals in the former concentration camp processed 1,672 defendants between 1945 and 1948. Conviction rates exceeded 88%. 426 defendants received death sentences. 297 of those sentences were carried out. Drestle was among them. His trial lasted 6 days. The documentation recovered from the facility was precise and comprehensive. The survivor testimony, including Marta Wasserhelly's 4-hour account from her hospital bed in Munich, was entered into the record in full. The fact that 2,000 prisoners were alive when the American column arrived was noted in the proceedings. His defense counsel argued it demonstrated a willingness to disobey orders when presented with a credible alternative. The tribunal was not persuaded. He was executed on June 14, 1946. The survivors who were notified of the verdict responded in ways that were as various as the people themselves. Some expressed satisfaction. Some expressed nothing, the particular absence of feeling that follows the realization that legal process, however complete, cannot return what was taken. Marta Wasserhelly, reached by a journalist in Budapest, where she had returned to her family after months of rehabilitation, said that she was glad it had happened. She said that gladness was the only word she had for it, even though it was not entirely the right word, because no word she knew was exactly right for what she felt. She said she thought about the 2 hours of suspension sometimes. The hours between the guards standing down and the engines arriving. She said she had decided over the years that those 2 hours were the most important of her life. Not because of the outcome, because of what she had discovered about herself during them. She said she had discovered that she was still capable of hope. She died in Budapest in 1987 at the age of 73, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, having spent the intervening 4 decades working as a teacher of literature at a secondary school in the Buda Hills. The legacy of what Patton did on April 29, 1945, does not fit cleanly into any single category of military history. It is not a tactical innovation. It is not a strategic breakthrough. It is not the story of a technology or a weapon or a doctrine that changed the nature of warfare. It is smaller than those things, and in a way that is difficult to articulate without sounding sentimental, larger than them. What Patton demonstrated on that morning was something that military institutions are structurally reluctant to teach because it cannot be systematized or replicated through training or doctrine. He demonstrated that the gap between an order being given and an order being carried out is a space, sometimes a very small space, measured in hours, where a different kind of force can operate. Not firepower, not maneuver, certainty. The absolute, credible, unambiguous certainty of a man who means what he says and has the capability to back it. He demonstrated that this force can, under specific conditions, change what a human being decides to do. This is not a lesson that military academies put in their curricula, because it requires something that cannot be trained into a person: the combination of genuine moral clarity and genuine operational capability that makes a threat credible, not because of rank or resources, but because the person making it is transparently, completely, unambiguously serious. Drestle did not stand down because Patton outranked him or because the column was close enough. He stood down because something in that message communicated with a clarity that cut through every other consideration that the man who wrote it meant every single word and had the means and the will to deliver on every single word. The distinction matters. A threat from someone who might mean it is a calculation. A threat from someone who unambiguously does mean it is a different thing entirely. Patton spent 35 years becoming someone from whom threats were not calculations. They were statements of fact about the future. There are perhaps 150 known cases from the final weeks of the Second World War in Europe where the approach of Allied forces created a situation similar to the one at Dressel's facility, where a commander with orders to eliminate prisoners faced the imminent arrival of liberating troops and made a choice. The outcomes of those cases are distributed across a spectrum that is almost impossible to look at directly. Some commanders fled without carrying out the orders, and the prisoners were liberated. Some carried out the orders and fled. Some carried out the orders and surrendered. A small number refused the orders and surrendered with their prisoners alive. The facility east of the Third Army's position on April 29, 1945, is one of approximately 20 documented cases where the outcome was determined at least in part by direct communication between an Allied commander and an SS facility commander in the hours before liberation. Of those 20, it is the only documented case where the communication came from an officer of Patton's seniority in Patton's name with Patton's personal guarantee attached to every word. Whether that specificity made the difference is not something that can be known with certainty. The alternative history in which the message was not sent or arrived too late, or was sent by a junior officer whose name carried no particular weight, that history did not happen, and the counterfactual cannot be tested. What can be said is this: 2,000 people were alive on the morning of April 30th who might not have been. One of them became a literature teacher. One of them spent 6 hours in an Augsburg farmhouse in silence before being taken into custody. One of them was a Polish engineer named Alexander, who stood up in a barracks and said very quietly that something had changed. Their names are documented. Their testimonies exist. Their lives after that morning are real. And here is the detail that almost nobody knows. The letter Patton received on May 12th, the one he folded into his uniform pocket and never spoke about, was found among his personal effects after his death in December 1945 and transferred to the Patton family archive. It remained there largely unexamined for decades. A researcher cataloging the archive in 1991 had it fully translated and entered into the record. The letter was from Alexander, the Polish engineer. The man who had stood up in the barracks and said something had changed. He had survived. He had found his way to a displaced persons camp in Bavaria, and from there, through months of paperwork and waiting, he had eventually made his way back to Warsaw. Before he left the displaced persons camp, he had asked the American soldiers there how to write a letter to a general. They had helped him. The letter said 3 things. It said that he had been an engineer before the war, and that he intended to be an engineer again. It said that he did not know what had made the guards stand down that morning, but that whatever it was, he wanted the people responsible for it to know that it had mattered. And then it said something that the researcher who translated it in 1991 noted was the most unexpectedly precise formulation she had encountered in years of working with survivor documents. It said, "You gave us back the 2 hours. That was enough." Patton never replied. He was dead within 7 months of receiving it. He never knew whether Alexander made it home. He never knew whether the literature teacher lived long enough to see her grandchildren. He sent a message and a column, and then he went back to work because that was what he did. And because the work was always the work. And because 2,000 people were alive, and that was the thing that mattered, and everything else was secondary to that single fact. From a morning in Bavaria, with a 20-sentence message, and 4 hours and a calculation about certainty to 2,000 lives that continued. Patton proved that the most powerful weapon in a general's arsenal is sometimes not the column he sends, but the absolute credibility of the man who sends it. The accounting happened. The names are in the record. Alexander became an engineer again. That is why this story is worth telling. Because the people history remembers least clearly are sometimes the ones who changed it most completely. And because 2 hours given back to people who had been told they had none left turned out to be more than enough.